The Gospel of Thomas is a story about Jesus as a child, and it is utterly fascinating, utterly bizarre, and completely fictional. For over 2,000 years, secrets regarding Jesus' life that were intentionally excluded from the Bible have existed. Not only were these secrets strange, but they were absolutely terrifying to scholars and researchers when they were discovered in the lost Gospel of Thomas. According to the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus had a twin brother named Didymus Judas Thomas. While the Bible depicts Jesus' personality as compassionate and forgiving, this ancient book tells of a side of Jesus you wouldn't have imagined. What were the secrets we knew nothing about, and what common perceptions about Jesus have we had wrong? Join us as we go back in time to reveal the lesser-known knowledge about Jesus' childhood and youth. In 1945, 52 old manuscripts were unexpectedly found in a place called Nag Hammadi in Egypt. Some of these manuscripts were called Gospels, which are books about Jesus' life. These writings are very old, from a time between 100 to 400 years after Jesus lived. Even though scholars knew these books existed a long time ago, they thought they were lost forever. But in 1945, something completely unexpected happened. They were finally found again, which caused a lot of debate and speculation. Some skeptics who read these manuscripts thought that the early church had hidden the truth about Jesus. They believed these lost Gospels would tell a different story about Jesus, but these writings actually just add more details to Jesus' life, such as what happened when he was a child and what happened between his death and resurrection. These stories were not well known before, so they were hidden, which is what apocrypha means. There are two types of these writings, apocrypha and Gnostic writings. These books were written for different reasons, like to entertain or to change how people thought about Jesus. One of the most surprising books found in Nag Hammadi is called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. It tells stories about Jesus when he was a child. These stories show Jesus in a way that's different from how Christians usually think of him. In this book, Jesus is mean to people for no reason and doesn't listen to his parents. This book is not part of the official Bible, but it's still interesting to see what some early Christians thought about Jesus' childhood. It's like a window into the past, showing us how people used to think about Jesus. Even though it's not considered an official part of Jesus' story, it's still a fascinating glimpse into the beliefs of early Christians. There are also writings called Gnostic writings, which means writings about special knowledge. These writings show Jesus as a wise teacher who shares secret knowledge. Two well-known Gnostic writings are the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Judas. In the Gospel of Judas, Jesus actually asks Judas to betray him. The Gospel of Thomas has some surprising words too. At one point, Peter says that women aren't worth as much as men, but Jesus responds by saying that he will help Mary, a female disciple, become like the men so she can enter heaven. These writings are very different from what the Bible says. They fit with the Gnostic beliefs, but they don't match what we read in the Bible. The Gnostic writings often have unusual ideas and quotes that don't align with the traditional story of Jesus. They show an entirely different side of Jesus. The early Christian church knew about the apocryphal and Gnostic Gospels but rejected them because they were written too long after Jesus' original followers had passed away. These writings also contain strange and incorrect ideas that didn't align with the true teachings of Jesus. Early Christian leaders like Irenaeus, who lived in 180 AD, recognized these writings as unreliable and false. Even though these lost Gospels are interesting from a historical perspective, they don't provide us with accurate information about the real Jesus. The New Testament writings are still the most reliable and earliest sources that tell us about Jesus' true words and actions. They are the best witnesses to the life and teachings of Jesus, and we can trust them to give us a true understanding of who Jesus was and what he taught. It didn't end there. Even before the big split between Catholics and Protestants, the early Christian church was already divided. Different groups had different ideas about what Christianity was all about, like what God was like, how he related to people, and how people should worship him. These groups often argued and sometimes even fought with each other. One group that was seen as a big threat to the mainstream church was the Gnostics. During the fighting and arguing, many of the Gnostics' writings were lost. But then, a big discovery was made at Nag Hammadi, and it shed new light on what the Gnostics believed. This discovery helped us understand more about the early days of Christianity and how it developed over time. The Bible has changed a lot since then, and our understanding of Jesus has changed too. But the Gnostic writings found at Nag Hammadi gave us a glimpse into a different side of Christianity, one that was previously unknown. The Gospel tells a story about Jesus when he was just 5 years old. He collected water from a stream and made small ponds, then he made birds out of mud and they came to life and flew away. But a boy nearby got angry and used a stick to disturb the water Jesus made. Jesus got upset and asked the boy why he did that and what the water and ponds ever did to him. Jesus was so upset that he went ahead to curse the boy that he would wither away like a tree and never grow leaves, roots, or fruit again. And that's exactly what happened to the boy. He shriveled up right there and eventually died. After Jesus cursed a boy, causing him to wither away, he continued walking through the village. Another child accidentally bumped into him, and Jesus cursed that child too, saying his life would be cut short. The child immediately fell to the ground dead. The parents of the child were grief-stricken and went to Jesus' father Joseph to complain. They told him that Jesus had killed 2 children in the village that day. Joseph was concerned and took Jesus aside to scold him. He asked Jesus why he kept doing those terrible things and causing people to suffer and hate them. But Jesus responded that Joseph wasn't speaking his own words and he would be quiet for his sake, but he promised those people would still face punishment. Then Jesus caused the child's parents to become blind. After Jesus behaved rudely, his father Joseph tried to discipline him by grabbing his ear and twisting it. But Jesus didn't listen and instead told Joseph he was looking for trouble but he was not finding it. He then told his father he was just being foolish. Right after, he asked Joseph if he didn't know he was special. Jesus was saying that he was too powerful and wise to be disciplined. Throughout the infancy Gospels, Jesus argues with teachers and people in charge, contradicting and humiliating them. He even does this to his own teachers, leaving Joseph frustrated and wondering who can control and teach Jesus. The infancy Gospel follows a pattern where Jesus performs 3 miracles and then teaches a lesson. The miracles have deeper meanings, but the lessons are straightforward, with Jesus speaking directly to the point. The author uses Jesus' words to make their point clear. After a while, Joseph asked a teacher named Zacchaeus to help Jesus learn important values like loving people his own age, respecting older people, and honoring elders. Zacchaeus tried his best to teach Jesus, starting with the basics like the alphabet, but Jesus surprised him by questioning Zacchaeus' own knowledge. He even corrected Zacchaeus' mistakes and made fun of him. Zacchaeus was shocked and embarrassed by Jesus' words. Zacchaeus felt overwhelmed and ashamed and apologized to Joseph for trying to teach Jesus. Afterwards, Zacchaeus was unable to continue teaching Jesus because he seemed to know more than his teacher. At first, Jesus used his powers to harm people, including killing 2 children, blinding 2 adults, and humiliating an older man. His father Joseph was very worried because the whole town was afraid of them now. But then something changed. After Jesus embarrassed a teacher named Zacchaeus, he suddenly decided to undo all the harm he had done. Jesus laughed and said those who were hurt would be healed and those who were blind would see again. He then added that he came from heaven to help them, not to hurt them. As soon as Jesus finished speaking, everyone he had hurt was suddenly made whole again. The people were amazed and a little scared, realizing that Jesus had incredible powers. From then on, no one dared to provoke him, fearing that he might curse them again. Bart Ehrman, an expert on the New Testament, explained that ancient storytellers didn't write stories to show characters learning and growing like we do today. Instead, they wrote about characters who were the same from start to finish. If someone was born with certain qualities, they kept those qualities their whole life. For early Christians, Jesus was the same from birth to adulthood. He was always divine and perfect. So the stories about Jesus' childhood might not be meant to show him learning and growing up. Instead, they showed Jesus as a divine being who was special from the start. Whatever Jesus did was considered right because he was Jesus, the Son of God. This means that the stories about Jesus' childhood aren't meant to teach us about his personal growth but rather to show us his divine nature and authority. The story of Jesus' childhood seems contradictory. He started out as a troublesome boy but grew up to be a peaceful healer. Maybe Thomas, who wrote the story, wanted to show Jesus having qualities that the Romans considered manly. In Roman culture, being a real man meant having virtues, which meant being strong, brave, and able to win battles. It also meant being in charge and having control over others, like women, children, and people from other countries. Some scholars think we should consider this when reading the infancy gospel. In this context, Jesus' disobedience and disrespect towards his father and teachers might be seen as signs of his strength and independence. To be a real man in Roman society meant being free and not having to answer to anyone else. So Jesus couldn't obey his father or teachers because he was superior to them. This way of thinking might have influenced the story of Jesus' childhood. But there's more to it than only his disobedience and rebellious character. The strange Gnostic writings, even though the infancy gospel is not part of the official Bible, scholars have tried to connect the Jesus in it with the Jesus in the Bible. They have looked at the text from different angles, thinking it might be influenced by the Old Testament, Greek and Roman ideas, or a specific type of Gnosticism. Some, like James Waddell, believe that someone who wasn't a Christian wrote the gospel as a way to mock the story of Jesus. Waddell points out that the writer doesn't seem to know much about Jewish customs and traditions from Jesus' time. This means that the author might have been a Greek writer or a Jewish person who hadn't yet been influenced by Christianity. This perspective offers a new way to understand the infancy gospel, not as a serious religious text but as a satire meant to poke fun at the idea of Jesus as a special child. James Waddell thinks that there was tension between the new Christians and traditional Jewish people. This tension came from the fact that Christians seemed to be ignoring some of the strict rules of Judaism. At the time, Christianity was still seen as a part of Judaism, and leaders like St. Paul were making big changes to the faith. These changes would have upset traditional Jewish people who believed in following the rules closely. So the story of Jesus doing things that were considered wrong, like killing, breaking the Sabbath, and disobeying his elders, might have been meant to mock the idea of Jesus being divine. By showing Jesus doing things that were no better than what a pagan god would do, the author could be poking fun at the idea of Jesus being elevated to a divine status. Now, here's something you didn't know. Some of Jesus' 35 mentions in the Quran share similarities with stories about Jesus from the Bible and other texts, including the Gnostic infancy Gospels. For example, the Quran tells a story similar to the one in the infancy Gospel, where Jesus brought clay birds to life. In the Quran it said he came to us with a sign from God that he makes a bird shape out of clay, and he breathes life into it, and it becomes a real bird by God's power. This shows that the Quran is drawing from a range of sources, including non-biblical texts, to tell its story about Jesus. By including these stories, the Quran presents Jesus as an important prophet and miracle worker but also one who is subject to God's will and power. The New Testament, like the Old Testament, is a collection of religious writings and stories that were gathered over time. It took many years, religious debates, and the rise and fall of empires to finalize the books that are now considered part of the New Testament. Scholars aren't entirely sure when each book was written, but they agree that the letters of St. Paul, written around 30 CE, were some of the first. The stories that would become the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were passed down orally before being written down in the 1st and 2nd centuries. The infancy Gospel likely used these canonical Gospels as references, so it was probably written after them. Some scholars think it might have been written as early as 80 CE, but it was definitely written by 185 CE since the important church leader Irenaeus mentioned it in one of his writings. But it's possible that Irenaeus was referring to the stories themselves, which were likely passed down orally for many years before being written down, rather than the actual written Gospel. This means that the exact date of the infancy Gospel's composition is still uncertain. That's not all. People often think of Gnostics as a group of mystical people who believed that the physical world was evil and that Jesus' spirit wouldn't have a physical body, but the truth is that Gnosticism was a diverse movement with many different philosophical and cosmic beliefs. While they did believe that physical matter was flawed, they had many other beliefs that differed from traditional Christianity, leading to conflicts with the Orthodox Church. The early Christian leaders wrote letters and sermons to argue against the Gnostics and other groups they considered heretics. The Gnostics' influence declined rapidly after the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. Christian bishops gained power within the empire's structure and used it to ban certain Christian sects and the books that supported their beliefs. The infancy Gospel of Thomas might have been among the banned books. This shows how the early Christian church tried to establish its authority and define what was considered acceptable Christianity, rejecting alternative beliefs and writings like the infancy Gospel. The canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all include stories about Jesus' early life, but none of them focus solely on his childhood. But in Gnostic texts, several Gospels devote themselves entirely to Jesus' youth. Besides the infancy Gospel of Thomas, there is also the infancy Gospel of James, which is part of the Nag Hammadi library and explores the same period of Jesus' life. There are even more infancy Gospels beyond these two well-known ones. Outside of the Nag Hammadi library, there are other texts like the Syak Infancy Gospel, the history of Joseph the Carpenter, and the life of John the Baptist. These Gospels offer different perspectives on Jesus' early life and childhood, providing a more detailed and nuanced understanding of his youth. They may not be part of the official Bible, but they are still valuable resources for understanding the diverse ways that people have imagined and shown Jesus' life. As Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, early Christians were eager to read and learn more about Jesus. They sought out any writings that mentioned him, and many texts were written to satisfy this demand. Most of these texts, including the New Testament, were written at least a century after Jesus' death. They built upon the stories already told in the canonical Gospels, with some like the Gospel of Thomas filling in specific gaps in the narrative. In those times, people didn't consider this as copying or stealing ideas, but rather as adding to the ongoing oral tradition. It wasn't until much later, after many years of discussion and confusion, that the New Testament became the unified text we recognize today. The early Christians saw these writings as contributions to their understanding of Jesus, not as competing or contradictory accounts. While the Gospel of Thomas has revealed terrifying truths about Jesus that no one knew about, there are some things people have believed about Jesus that are not true and not even in the Bible, and you might find the fourth one completely hard to believe. False perceptions about Jesus. To begin with, here's the most common lie. Jesus had long hair. For centuries, people have pictured Jesus with long hair and a flowing beard, but in Jesus' time, most men were clean-shaven and had short hair. While Jesus might have had a beard at certain points during his ministry, especially when he was traveling, it's unlikely he kept it that way all the time. Similarly, it's unlikely he had long hair, as this was typically associated with Jewish men who had taken a special vow called the Nazirite vow. We know Jesus didn't take this vow because it required abstaining from wine, and Jesus was known to drink wine. Instead, it's more likely that Jesus kept his hair short, following the common style of his time. This means that the traditional image of Jesus with long hair and a beard might not be entirely accurate. Another common misconception about Jesus is the date of his birth. The Bible doesn't mention a specific date, and the Gospel writers don't provide any clues about the time of year Jesus was born. Despite this, December 25th has become widely accepted as Jesus' birthday. But where did this date come from, and who dedicated this day to him? The early Christian church didn't celebrate Christmas for the first 3 centuries after Jesus' death. Instead, they observed other religious holidays like Epiphany and Easter. The first recorded mention of Christmas on a Roman calendar wasn't until 336 CE. December 25th was likely chosen to align with the existing Roman festival of Saturnalia, making Christianity more appealing to the Roman people. This was a strategic move by the early Christian church, which often adapted its teachings to fit in with local beliefs and customs. By doing so, they made it easier for people to convert to Christianity, which was necessary for spreading the religion. The Bible mentions James as Jesus' brother and also refers to other siblings of Jesus, but the Catholic Church teaches that Jesus was an only child and had no siblings. This might seem contradictory, but it's related to the Church's doctrine of perpetual virginity, which holds that Mary remained a virgin and sinless throughout her life. To reconcile this with the Bible's mention of Jesus' siblings, many church scholars have suggested that James was actually Jesus' cousin rather than his brother. This explanation attempts to resolve the obvious discrepancy between the Bible's account and the Church's doctrine. This next fact might shock you. If you look at any painting or depiction of Jesus on the cross, you'll probably see him with nails through his palms. These wounds have become a well-known symbol of Christianity, but the Bible doesn't specifically mention this detail. In fact, if someone were crucified through their hands, the weight of their body would likely cause the nails to tear through their hands, making it impossible for them to remain on the cross. This has raised questions about the accuracy of this common depiction of the crucifixion. The Bible describes Jesus as being crucified, but it doesn't provide details about the exact method. Some Christians believe that Jesus never married because the New Testament doesn't mention a wife, but the absence of evidence doesn't necessarily mean he was celibate. In fact, it was highly unusual for a man of Jesus' age and status not to have a wife. Even if he was a traveling prophet, many prophets at that time had wives and families, so it's possible Jesus did too. The idea of Jesus' celibacy didn't become a major focus until a church leader named Tertullian wrote about it. Tertullian, along with St. Paul, played a significant role in shaping the church's views on sexuality and intimacy. He argued that Jesus had to be celibate to remain sinless. The Bible has many translations that can be disputed, but one of the most widespread is the translation of the Greek word, tekon. In ancient Greece, this word described a group of poor workers who did various jobs to make ends meet, like building walls, furniture, or clearing land. They were essentially day laborers doing whatever work they could find to survive. But when translated into English, tekon became a carpenter, which has led to a common image of Jesus as a skilled builder of houses. This translation has created a misleading picture of Jesus' occupation. Instead of being a specialized carpenter, it's more likely that he was a traveling laborer who took on various jobs to get by. This understanding changes our perception of Jesus' life and work. He was probably more of a manual laborer doing physical work to support himself and not a skilled craftsman building houses. Our popular image of Jesus comes from Italian Renaissance art, which shows him and other biblical figures as Europeans from the 1500s. These artists didn't try to accurately depict Jesus' appearance and instead painted him as a white-skinned European. But Jesus was actually a Middle Eastern Jewish man, likely with darker olive skin. He wouldn't have had the European features we often see in paintings. Another inaccuracy in these depictions is Jesus' clothing. He's often shown wearing long robes, but these were only worn by the wealthy on special occasions. Jesus, being a humble carpenter, would have worn simpler clothing like a knee-length tunic and a mantle called a himti. These would have been plain and undyed, fitting for someone of his status. While it's true that Jesus wore sandals, the rest of his attire was likely much simpler than what we see in Renaissance art. These artists dressed him up in fancy clothes unlike what he would have worn in ancient Judea. Do you think the Gospel of Thomas's accounts of Jesus' personality are true, and which of his actions did you not expect considering how the Bible views him? We would love to know in the comments. If you enjoyed watching this video, don't forget to leave a like, share it with your family and friends, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next updates.